I became a Hindu, and I was involved with this for 15 years, from age 22 to 37.
Michael Austin thought he had found a path to God until he realized he was actually in a cult. Then Michael became agnostic for many years, but that all changed when he received an extraordinary message.
And I hear a voice, and the voice says to me, "You better get right with me."
You called me out of the grave. You called me into the light. You called my name and then my heart came alive.
You're listening to the final story in our summer series, In Search of Truth. It's part 2 of a 2-part episode of GPS, God, People, Stories, an outreach of the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association. I'm Phil Fleischman. My co-host, Jim Kirkland, is on vacation. Michael Austin followed his guru to India in hopes of finding meaning and peace. And on one of his trips to India, Billy Graham encountered a group of students just like Michael.
They've been here studying at the feet of some guru, and they're going back disillusioned. Young people searching for something, anything to find peace and happiness in a world that seems to have gone mad and insane.
You'll hear more from Billy Graham a little later in the episode as he explains that the only way to find true peace is through a relationship with Jesus Christ. You can learn more about that right now, though, by going to our website, findpeacewithgod.net, or call our 24-hour prayer line. The number is 888-388-2683. That's 888-388-2683. Both that number and the website are in the show notes.
GPS.
God,
People, Stories.
In part 1 of Michael Austin's story, he explained how he got involved in a Hindu meditation cult when he was 22 and living in New York City.
No, I didn't call it a cult at the time, but as soon as I got out of it, I looked back and I recognized I was in a cult for 15 years.
He spent those years traveling from India to New York and beyond with a well-known Indian guru named Muktananda. This guru claimed to be celibate, but Michael saw things that led him to believe otherwise, and others would eventually accuse the guru of abusing young women in the cult.
But I'm noticing another thing, that other people who have leadership position in this cult are sexually promiscuous.
Even though Michael hadn't been raised to believe in God or have a moral foundation rooted in faith, he sensed that the guru and his followers were doing something wrong, and it offended him.
I discovered I had a conscience. How about that? My colleagues had no conscience at all. They repeated the quote-unquote mantra, "He's God, he can do anything he wants." So they had no problem with this at all.
He didn't know it at the time, but Michael now believes God was waking up his conscience and leading him out of the cult.
Not my doing. I had been living in a world that I would describe it as a world where good is bad and bad is good. Backwards. A complete illusion, delusion.
At the same time Michael was starting to think about walking away from the cult, a woman came into his life and they ended up getting married.
Now, at this particular time in my life, I was going out of the cult. The person that I married, I didn't know this, but I discovered this. She was coming into the cult.
Michael and his wife had a baby boy together in the early 1980s, and by then, Michael was ready to kiss the cult goodbye. When the guru died, Michael saw his opportunity to finally part ways for good.
And from my perspective, I did something very foolish. I agreed to going back to India to his funeral. And we had a son who was a year and a half of age. And we took him. So the three of us went to India to the funeral. And for me, this was tying a bow, a nice little neat bow on the package and sending it off. This was the culmination.
But Michael's wife wasn't ready to leave the cult.
And so now the plot thickens. I had a job, and it was time for me to go back to work. We were there for about a month. And my wife said, well, I'd like to stay for a while. So why don't you go ahead? And in a month or so, I've got the airline tickets and we'll come back. Well, that was the end of my marriage. She did not return.
What followed was a long and painful divorce.
And the lessons learned on my part is sin has consequences. If I ever had any doubt about that, I learned otherwise. Sin has consequences. So, we're all continuing to live. My son is now 40 years old.
Michael and his son don't currently have a relationship.
There's hope. There's hope. I don't give up hope. But I also have to face the reality that this was, the whole situation was born in a satanic cult.
When he finally broke ties with the cult, Michael was in his late 30s.
I was adrift, totally lost, lost my family, lost my faith, religion, whatever you want to call it. My what I believed was shattered. I became a skeptic, and I was reading skeptic literature, which perceives of all religion as false. Went through a period of going to their conferences and saying, yeah, I experienced that. yeah, this is an incredible fraud. The deity that we were worshiping, that I was worshiping, is the deceiver, the dark one, and the Lord of Yoga.
It would take Michael almost 20 more years to discover who God really is. Until then, he became an agnostic, but he still dabbled in his old religion from time to time. In fact, that's what he was doing when he had an encounter that changed everything.
Boy, I love to tell this story. And by the way, I think this is what he wants us to do. He wants us to tell our story. Anyway, I'm now up in Schenectady, New York.
That was the early 2000s, and Michael was working in public relations in Schenectady.
And I opened my office up there. I found an office building, rented a little office, and hired an assistant, a young woman who I was training to become an assistant to a PR consultant.
That young woman was a Christian, and she actively shared her faith with Michael.
This assistant of mine had been inviting me to come to church and meet Jesus. And she and I are having this conversation. It goes something like, Michael, you need to come and meet Jesus. My life has changed. You got to meet these wonderful people, on and on. And I'm saying to her, I'll never forget this. I said to her, Mary, her name was Mary, this sounds so good. It sounds a little bit too good to be true. Have you ever considered that you may be in a cult? That was our conversation.
Now, we mentioned that Michael was still dabbling in his old ways, nearly 20 years after leaving the cult. Well, one night in New York, he was alone on his bed meditating. He was attempting to have an out-of-body experience, a satanic practice where he would try to leave his body